Afternoon, everyone. I'm your host Rajni Sharma from BMJ, and I welcome you all to the second BMJ live webinar fortnightly series for doctors across India and South Asia. The first one was on insight on diabetes and COVID 19 and received a tremendous response in terms of participation. We will have more webinars in the coming week on topics related to chronic kidney disease and COVID 19, palliative care, clinical decision support tools, and a few more. These webinar series aligned with our vision of helping to create a healthier world. As a global healthcare knowledge provider, we share knowledge and expertise to improve healthcare outcomes. We do this by developing and distributing relevant peer-reviewed resources and evidence-based tools. During these difficult times, knowledge sharing is more important, and clinicians need resources they can trust. That is where we can help. Visit bmj.com to find out more about what we offer. Moving on to today's webinar on how to develop uh, j- and communicate a research question. I would like to inform that there is a question and answer tab on your screen where you can post your questions to Dr. Anita. She will address all your questions depending upon the time available. We'll have two polls during this session, so please respond to whatever it appears on your screen. I now invite our respected speaker for the day, Dr. Anita, who is a clinical editor at BMJ. She has been closely involved in handling research manuscripts from across the globe and has led several workshops for researchers and doctors on medical writing and publishing at national and international platforms. Over to you now, Dr. Anita, please.
Thank you, Rajni, and hello everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I'm really delighted to be here today and have this opportunity to interact with you all virtually and hopefully share some insights on what we as editors look for in research papers and guide you on developing a good research question. So I'll just take a moment to share my slides. And in the meantime, you might want to think about why you're here today or why you're interested in doing research. Just want to make sure everybody is able to hear. I see some messages in the chat box, and hopefully our coordinator will be able to help you if you're not able to hear. But just drop in a line if you're not able to hear or not able to see the slides, and we'll do our best to make it work. All right. So there may be one of many reasons why you're interested in doing research, and that might be to advance your career, to share about your work, to get into a high impact journal. It might be to connect with a wider scientific community. It might be for any of these reasons that you are interested in doing research. Now, it's important to remember that the most important reason among these is actually that medical progress is based on research. So, any improvement that we as healthcare providers seek to make in advancing patient care or in improving the health of people, be it a drug, a therapy, an intervention, all of it must be based on solid research. So, it must have been tested before. And that is something that we have seen with the COVID-19 pandemic too, where there is a lot of research that is going on to share about, to understand the causes and effects of the disease, and also to develop interventions for it. So over 4,000 trials are registered in the World Health Organization registry. And we've been publishing a lot of this research in the BMJ as well, as you can see on our website. So if you visit bmj.com, we have a COVID-19 page where all of our work on all of our publications on the pandemic are free to access. And this is just the research page. So we'll just take a moment here. It'll be helpful for us to understand who all are here today and where you are in your journey as a researcher. So I'll ask the team to put together the poll. So can we have the results of the poll? Has everyone been able to vote? Okay, so we have some people, so about a quarter of people who are learning about research. A few of you have been involved in a research study, and many of you have published in have published one or more research papers in a journal. So that is excellent, and will hopefully guide our discussion from here on. Sorry, just give me a moment to come back. Okay, so it might be, since a lot of you have already been doing research, it might be that that you are working in one of these settings. It could be that you're doing public health research in the community, or you might be doing medical research in the wards, or actually looking at medical records, or working in a lab. And the most important thing in any of these settings is the research question. So I would encourage you that never ever start your study without a research question. And if I can go so far to say that the research question is the key to your study, to a good study, and it will actually make your paper attractive to editors. So the first step, if any research that you're doing, the first thing is to have a clear plan on how you're going to go about your research. And the first step is to turn your ideas into a research question, which is what we will be covering today, on how do you turn your ideas into research question. um, and then review the literature, agree on your team who are going to be your investigators, co-authors, seek statistical input. Yes, that is before you start your research study. Design the study, develop your methods, think about the ethics of your study design, and write your research proposal and apply for funding. And why a good research question is important is because that is what makes a study original and important. In fact, as editors, the two things that we look for are whether the research question fills a clear gap in the evidence base, and will its answer make a difference to anyone. So, clear reporting of research questions is an essential skill. And the presentation today is also around these two elements, on how do you first develop a good research question, and then how do you report your research question. All right, I think I'm getting a message that you're not able to see the slides. So I'll just maybe ask the team to share the slides in a minute. Okay, so can we move to slide 11? Yes. So here we are. As I was talking, so if you weren't able to see the earlier slides, we are still getting just into the meat of the matter or the meat of the presentation today, and that is talking about the research question. I hope all of you are able to see the slides now. Essentially, what I was saying is why a good research question is critical. As I said, I consider as an editor, I think the research question is actually the key that will help you make your research paper attractive to editors and to readers. And you have to think of these two things when you frame your research question. Is one is, does the research question fill a clear gap in evidence, and will its answer make a difference to anyone? And the second aspect, the first is you develop a good research question, and then the second aspect is to report your research question clearly. If we can move to the next slide, please. So, what makes a good research question? Now, some of you, a lot of you have already published in journals. So, you might be familiar with this acronym of what we call as PICO or PECO. So, what it stands for, these are actually the four components of a good research question. P stands for the population or the patients or what problem is being addressed. I or E is either the intervention or the exposure. C is for the comparator group, and O is the outcome or endpoint. So these are the four aspects of what we say a good research question. And we will see a few examples from here on, which will give you a good sense of how these four aspects form a part of a research question. Next slide, please. Yes, so here is a paper. So both of the examples we'll discuss are based on the recent pandemic. So this is the first research paper which we published in the BMJ. It is on use of personal protective equipment against coronavirus disease by healthcare professionals in China. And the research question, as you can see, is, does personal protective equipment protect healthcare professionals providing care for COVID-19 patients in Wuhan, China? So, based on this, I would like you all, maybe if you have a notepad with you, to jot down what are the PICO or what is the PECO or the PICO of this research question. And we'll move to the next slide where you'll be able to see these. Yes, next slide, please. Okay, so here we have it. P is for the problem or the patient population. Here it is actually healthcare professionals who were part of the study. They were given the intervention or they were given PPE. So P or your population here is healthcare professionals providing care to COVID-19 patients in Wuhan, China. So as you see, that's a very specific population. So you get a very clear idea on who will be a part of this study. I, intervention, is the use of PPE. So all those healthcare professionals were given the PPE, personal protective equipment. That was the intervention that was being studied. There wasn't a comparator because everybody was given the intervention in this case. So they didn't have a comparator arm. This is an observational study. So sometimes you may not have a comparator, and you have an outcome, which is the symptoms of corona or a positive test for COVID-19. So these were the outcome measures they studied to understand whether PPE is actually effective and protects healthcare professionals. So that's how, from a research question, you can actually see the elements of a PICO or a PECO. Next slide. So this is a famous study. You can click again and you'll get the research question at the bottom. But this is the famous study. A lot of you might have come across the Oxford vaccine, which is being touted as the vaccine that might help us all out of the pandemic. And this study was published in the Lancet. And the research question is whether is this vaccine safe and effective against SARS-CoV-2? And again, next slide, you'll be able to see, you can think of the PECO or the PICO yourself, and you'll be able to see this on the next slide. So again, here you have all the four components. P is your population, which is healthy adults with no history of lab confirmed COVID-19. So this is, so as you know, a vaccine might be given to healthy adults. So the population here was healthy adults. The intervention was the specific vaccine against COVID-19, and they had a comparator arm. So they gave some adults on a randomized basis another vaccine, which was not against COVID-19, but just another standard vaccine. And the outcome they studied was, so they were looking at safety and efficacy. So the outcome was, for safety was adverse events and reactions, and effectiveness is they checked for whether people who received the vaccine developed an antibody response to COVID-19. So that's how, these are the four elements. And as you can see, once you have these four components outlined, it is very easy to put together your research question. I see one chat, so I'll just cover this now instead of covering it later. But I see a question about T. So why is time not mentioned? And yes, sometimes we do say it is PICO T. We put a small t, which actually mentions the outcome at, whether you'll be collecting the outcomes in 1 month or 3 months or 6 months. So you can actually specify the outcome further by saying that antibody response in people within 1 month or within 2 weeks. So you can actually have a small t there as well to specify when the outcomes will be collected and whether it is a short-term study or you're looking at long-term effects of an intervention. All right, moving then to the next slide. I think we have an example for you. Yes, so we do have a live poll for you, which is another research question based on a study published in the BMJ. So I'll let you answer the question, and then we'll discuss it. Okay, let's see the answers now. All right, so 3/4 of you, 75% are correct. Yes, the intervention is manual acupuncture. And so looking at the different aspects, the population here is patients with episodic migraine. The intervention is manual acupuncture. The comparator is sham acupuncture and usual care. And the outcome that was measured was reduction in migraine days and migraine attacks. So well done to all of you. So if there's one thing that you can take from the session today, I would say about developing your research question or converting ideas that you have for a research question into a proper research question using these elements of a PICO or a PECO. PECO is usually used for an observational study where you might want to just study the effects of a particular exposure. So you will not actually be giving something to the population or to the participants, but you'll just be measuring the effects of, for example, the diet, or if you're studying a community of smokers, you'll be testing the effects of smoking on their health or whatever, based on what you're studying. Okay, moving on then. Why it's important? So one is it's important to have a good research question because that really sets the tone for your research study. And moving to the next slide then, another important reason is once you have drafted, so you might come across a research question in through different avenues. You might be having ward rounds and come across a patient who does not respond in the usual way to treatment, or you might be working in a community and they might have certain health problems that you want to study. So there are different avenues that might provide you with ideas for a research question. And once you have put together your research question, so once you've identified the PICO, so the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcome, which will all help you focus what are you exactly trying to study, the next step is then to do a literature review. So you actually want to know whether the research question that you have has already been answered, or if there are elements of it that have been answered and there are gaps that still remain. So you need to do, once you have your PICO, you need to go and look at, there are these two resources that are shared at PubMed and Cochrane Library, perhaps as starting points on what has been done on the research question that you have identified. Now, it might be that the question has already been answered, which in that case, that's fine. Or it might be that the question has been answered. For example, you know that a treatment works in certain patients, but you don't know whether it works in your patients, and so it might still be reasonable to do a study for that reason. But the very next step, once you've identified your research question, is to go and conduct a literature review so you can further refine your question. Next slide. And also, a research question will help you with these two steps. So, as you remember in the plan, we said the first is to formulate your research question, the second step is to conduct a literature review, and the third step is to choose a appropriate study design. And the research question will actually help you choose the appropriate study design. Now, this is just a chart which you can find on the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine. I've shared the link to the website below. But this is a very helpful chart to understand which type of study is appropriate to answer the question that you've asked. So if you have a question that's asking about, for example, what's happening in this community, or what's happening in this locality, or what's happening in this group of patients, then you're probably going to choose a descriptive study design. If you're looking for a question that looks at why or how is something happening, then it's probably an observational study that you would do. And if you're actually trying to if you have a research question that's asking whether X treatment or X drug will work, then what you're trying to do is perhaps an experimental study. And do go to the website of the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine. That has a lot more resources on examples of different questions and which study design is appropriate at any given situation. So that's also why a question is very important to formulate right at the start when you start thinking about doing research. Okay, moving on then to the next slide. So once you have narrowed down your research question, these are what we call the finer criteria, and you can put all of them. So the whole slide has the criteria. So if you just keep clicking, you'll come to the end of the slide. That's just for the person handling the slides for me. So the finer criteria, and we'll see them coming down, the finer criteria are actually the criteria that we as editors, reviewers, funders use to understand whether a study is something that interests us or is a study that we would like to publish. So the finer criteria, as you can see, is first is F, feasible. Is your research question feasible? Is it answerable with available resources? Is it interesting? Is it novel? Does it add to what we already know on a given topic? Is it ethical? So approval by ethics committee is mandatory. And then, is it relevant? So would it actually go on to influence practice? Would it change the way we practice? Would it change health policy? Is there a question? Would the question fill an evidence gap that matters to patients and public? So these are actually criteria that we as editors use when deciding whether a research question is one that we should be interested in, or is a research paper one that we want to consider further. And I would encourage you that once you have your research question, think of the finer criteria and try to make notes on how your research question meets these criteria. And you can then use these notes to actually formulate the introduction of your protocol or your research paper. So you would actually then answer to all these questions, whether your study is feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. And once we see that in your introduction, we as editors would be interested. So these are criteria that you can use to identify whether your research question meets these criteria and how you report them in your paper. Next slide, please. So coming now, so once you have your research question, we assume you've found your study design, we've done your research, and now coming to reporting your research study, or reporting and therefore reporting your research question. As we've shared here, most of you would be aware, most all studies usually have one research question, which is the central research question, also known as the primary study question. And we say that it's usually more effective to stick to one question per paper. Now, it might be that because you have this population or you have this group of patients you're studying, you want to look at different questions. So you want to study different characteristics of this population or different subgroups that you want to analyze. It is still effective. It is still most effective to have just one primary study question, because that will assess, that will help you determine your sample size and whether the study is actually feasible. You can have secondary questions, but usually they will not meet the sample size which is necessary to have to determine the answers for these. But you can still have secondary outcomes, but make sure that you have a very clear primary study question. Okay, next slide, please. So now this is the second part. You have your research question, you have done your research, and now you are getting on to writing your research paper. And most of you, I assume, would have already published in journals, but a lot of you might also have been reading a lot of research papers. And if you go back now and notice, usually a research paper is organized into these 4 sections. You have an introduction, a methods, a results section, and a discussion. So what we call as IMRAD format for research papers. And the introduction is the section where you report your research question. And it is quite a nice format. So introduction is you explain why you asked this research question. Methods is what did you do once you have a research question. Results is what did you find, and discussion is what does it all mean. But we focus on the introduction here because what we are trying to cover is the research question today. Next slide. So the introduction essentially provides a brief background for the audience. As I mentioned earlier, use the finer criteria to develop how your research question meets these finer criteria. And in essence, you will have the introduction for your research paper there. So essentially what we are looking for is what is the gap in knowledge that your study is trying to fill, and why should we care that this gap is filled? Why is it important? As I said, once you have a research question, you would have done a literature review. You might have identified several papers on the topic that you're studying, but we suggest that you cite only the most relevant studies. So ones which are perhaps the most, most balanced, evidence-based, and current, essentially, and explain the research questions background and importance. So we don't really want you to cite all the 50 or 70 studies that you have reviewed, but the most important that cater to the narrowly focused research question you've developed. And then end the introduction with stating your research question in plain and simple language. So the 4 elements, PICO, state that so don't write PICO, but actually state your research question in the last paragraph of the introduction. So that leads nicely into the next section. So you have your research question, and then you go on into methods on what you did with the research question. All right, next slide. Okay, so what editors look for in the introduction, essentially, these are the things I look for is whether the research question is clear, the finer criteria, but just maybe different wording. But is the research question clear? Has it been stated clearly with a clear justification on why it was necessary to do the study? We are very interested in knowing whether the research question was determined before data collection began. We are less interested in studies where you have your data and then you find out, you look at the data that you've collected and then try to identify certain associations. I think most editors and reviewers are able to make that out. So I would encourage you, as we said, the first step is to identify a good research question. And then we look at whether the research question and the answer are likely to improve real decisions in practice, public health, and policy. And And we'll move to the next slide where you'll see the actual peer review process. So I'll just go over this. Oh, you can't probably see my cursor, but so you see the red box, which is research submitted. So at least in the BMJ, we receive about 10 to 12 research papers every day. And we are able to publish only 4 research papers approximately every week. So you see, we do have to reject a large volume of research papers. And if you see the red and the blue zones, which is research submitted and then screening. So if you see in screening, we reject about 3 to 4 thousand papers out of the 4 to 5 thousand that we receive. And I'll just give you some insight into how we screen papers. So once we see a research paper, the thing that we look for, the first thing that we look for is the research question. All that we have covered today is the thing that helps determine whether we are interested in even reading the abstract further or reading the paper further. So essentially, at the screening stage, based on the abstract and the research question, we decide whether we are interested in taking it forward and moving it on to the peer review stage. And so, what all that we have discussed until now, and even some aspects of choosing the right study design and reporting your results are important to help you go to essentially the peer review stage, which is very critical, I think, I would say, as a researcher, as an author for you, because at least from the peer review and the editorial feedback, you'll be able to improve on your paper. So I would encourage you to strongly, improve your work on your research question at the very start and on how you report this in the abstract and the introduction so that editors are interested in your paper and take it on to the next stage of peer review. So once we have papers back from peer review, it comes to an editorial meeting where we decide, I think we meet every week, and about 8 or 10 editors from across the world discuss research papers that are back from peer review. And we decide which ones we want to take on and go back to the authors and so on. So our acceptance rate at the BMJ presently is around 7%, I think. But I think you could do very well with what you've learned here, and what Rajni will also be sharing some resources to at least move your paper onwards towards external review in whichever journal you're interested in publishing in. All right, so with that, I will end my talk. We will be doing some question and answers, but I'll just hand over to Rajni for a bit to talk about research to publication.
Thank you, Dr. Anita. Whilst Dr. Anita reviews the questions received from you all, let me inform you that BMJ India is launching a 6 months e-learning certification course in research to publication in September 2020. It is for individual doctors. However, an institutional subscription is already available for purchase. It is an online research methodology and publishing program specifically designed for doctors and healthcare researchers. It can help you develop your research skills and get papers published in high impact journals. Sadly, approximately 85% of health research is wasted, usually because it asks all wrong questions, is badly designed, not published, or poorly reported. Research to publication can help overcome that. It has been developed in collaboration between the BMJ senior research editors and senior academics at the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF, Clinical and Translation Science Institute. This online course has 8 units and 52 modules. I'm sure that Dr. Anita is now ready to answer your questions. Dr. Anita, over to you now, please.
Hello, sorry, I got disconnected. So I'm back. Rajni, are you done? Can I proceed to questions?
Yeah, yeah, please proceed.
Okay. Okay, we'll try to take a few questions here today. There are several questions. I'll try to take the ones that are directly applicable to what we've discussed. Um, okay, so let's start with one. I think there are several questions on PICO and about the comparator, especially because I think a couple of one example didn't have a comparator, and that is very common, especially in observational studies where you're not actually giving an intervention, you're not actually testing something on a population. So you might just be recording, variables for certain populations. So you're just measuring their exposure. Just to take an example, for example, if you are looking at the impact of fatty diets in women and whether they develop breast cancer, for example, just making this up right here. So your population might actually be women in the age group of whatever, 30 to 60 or 70, whatever. And you might have a certain area in which you're conducting the study. So I'm in Mumbai, so I might say, we are doing this study in this area of Mumbai where we are going to look at the diet of women. So that is, the diet of women would become the exposure and whether they go on to develop breast cancer, which is the outcome. So there is no comparator because I'm not really measuring it against another diet. Another option might be to study two different diets. So that is where you will have an intervention and a comparator. So you actually ask women, okay, this is your diet for the next whatever years, and this is your diet for the next few years, and then we go and measure what is the outcome or what impact it has on your health. In that case, where you have an intervention and a comparator. So usually in observational studies, which is a lot of research that is being done, observational studies might be something that you are more likely to be involved in. You are essentially just going to have an exposure or an intervention for that matter. I see someone's asked why was there no comparison in the PPE study. I think that's up to the researchers to answer, but essentially it is a crisis. It was a pandemic where not many knew on what might work or what might not work, and it just seemed reasonable to just offer safety whatever was available to whoever is caring for patients. And so we might not know. I think there's a question that mentions we don't know if it is just by chance or the PPE actually helped. But I think that's just the constraints of doing research, and that is one of the limitations that the researchers would identify in their study. So another very important aspect is to identify the limitations of your study. No study is going to be perfect. All studies are going to have certain limitations, so please be upfront about it. Your study might have been too small, or there might have been reasons why patients did not follow through up to the time limit that you were expecting. So most studies are going to have these limitations, and editors and reviewers are going to pick up on these limitations. So we encourage you for any paper in the discussion section on your own, identify the limitations of your study. Okay, now there are a few specific questions on drugs and which drugs we should test. I think I'm not going to take those ones because I'm not really the subject matter expert for those. Um, Okay, I see a question of how to state a research question or title when we have more than one objectives. So as I said, we encourage you usually to have just one primary study question. So really very clearly identify what is it that you want to study. It is really okay to have secondary outcomes that you will measure in any population because you are undertaking the study and you are going to work with these patients and you are going to collect this amount of data. So it is okay to have pre-specified secondary outcomes, but it is usually good to have a single clear primary study question, what we say, which will also help you determine the sample size for your study and whether it is powered enough to answer your research question. Another question that I can take is how to choose the right journal to publish. I feel we are asked to pursue journals with highest impact factor. Yes, and that is a problem. I think some of you might have heard of this phrase called as "publish or perish," which is sort of the way things are working in academia or in medical education and medical research. Presently, I mean, at the one end, it is encouraging people to do research and to publish their work, but there is this catch where there might be research that is being done which is not really necessary. Or I saw another question here that does it really need to be important to, does it really need to matter to someone, if the research that you're doing. And yes, I encourage you that if you want to make it into a good journal, in any case, I think any research that is done needs to matter to people, to the, at least the population that you are studying, and it needs to ideally make a difference to science. That is why I would encourage you to do research and not just do research to publish. How to choose the right journal, really based on the specialty, whom are you trying to reach. So I often also encourage people, now if you're working in a hospital and there are certain processes that you see you want to improve, so you might be doing a very focused hospital, quality improvement study or a hospital processes study, and you want to make sure that all the people or the administrators of that hospital read about your research. And so that, then in that case, it might also make sense to publish in the journal which is, published either by that hospital, which goes to everybody in that hospital. So essentially you have to see whom are you trying to reach, who is your target audience. And for the BMJ also, we have a link. If you go to instructions to authors on, is the BMJ the right journal for my research? So we actually give you a checklist of questions to understand whether you should even consider submitting to the BMJ. For example, in the BMJ, we don't publish any animal-based studies. So that is a clear, no. So if we get such a paper, we are going to reject it right away. Another thing is that we might not publish highly specialized surgery. So if highly specialized topics. So if you have, for example, a study on hand reconstructive surgery, we are not going to publish it. You will have to look for a journal, a specialty journal that publishes on those topics. I hope that answers. I would really, I mean, we as editors too, we hardly think about impact factor, which was mentioned in the question. I would really encourage you to think about the audience that you're trying to reach, and the quality of the journal as well. So it's especially with open access, there is a lot of fear nowadays of predatory journals. So making sure that the journal that you're submitting to is authentic, it has a bunch of research papers that people in the specialty you work in or the community you work in are reading or are publishing with. Those are good criteria to think of when you decide where to publish your paper. All right. There are quite a few questions. Does every research need ethics committee approval? Every human-based research, human participant research needs ethics committee approval, ideally. And you can, for further guidance, look at the guidance from the World Association of Medical Editors, and also the World Medical Declaration of Helsinki. So that is concerning ethics for research involving human participants. And they do end up updating their guidance. Another group to look at is the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors, so ICMJE. They publish guidelines for any research submitted to biomedical journals. And in fact, even at the BMJ and most of the prominent journals, the first thing that we mentioned in our instructions to authors is make sure that the paper you're submitting is compliant with the ICMJE guidance. So that's the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, ICMJE. They constantly update their guidance. So you might want, and they cover every aspect of research, so related to ethics, related to submitting, related to peer review, how to formulate your paper, all of that. So I would encourage you to look at those. I think they were updated last in 2019, so you might want to look at the guidance there. I see there are a few questions on how to choose the right journal, which I hope I've answered to some level. Um, Please tell us about plagiarism. I think that's the last question perhaps I'll take given the time. So the last question that we'll take is, please tell us about plagiarism. Plagiarism is a form of scientific misconduct, unfortunately quite common, especially we see a lot of it in postgraduate medical research. And in fact, a lot of universities now are putting in systems where all their postgraduate research goes through a plagiarism check before it is even considered for publication. So plagiarism is essentially where a portion of is without giving appropriate credit. to the original author. So it could be words, it could be an image, it could be ideas that you've taken from someone without giving appropriate credit. Now that is very important. What we mean by giving appropriate credit is actually either citing the study, so referencing it, or paraphrasing it. So even if you're using material from another paper, close the paper, put it in your own words, and then reference the study. Or if you're taking a large chunk of paper, so if you're taking a large portion of text, or if you're taking some figures or images, then actually we would encourage you to go back to the author, seek their permission, and then mention the author's permission in your paper. So that is what we mention as giving appropriate credit to the original, the original person who holds that piece of work. And if that is not done, then most like all journals essentially do have a plagiarism check software. I think there are Turnitin and others are ones that are available more commonly too. I think we use Authenticate at the BMJ, but essentially all the research papers that come to the BMJ, even before they come to the editor, pass through this software, which helps us identify portions of text that might be a copy from other material. And so, yeah, so that is something to steer clear of. It is a form of scientific misconduct, actually, and encourage. A lot of you are already, I think, experienced researchers. So if you are training junior doctors or junior researchers, encourage them to think about this and how they can avoid getting into plagiarism. All right. I think we'll close with that. You will find my email. So the next slide does have my email. If you have any questions, please do write to me or contact Rajni. Any of us would be available. It was great to be part of this session today. I'm really sorry for some of the technological issues we faced, but thank you for staying on. And yeah, and keep in good health for the rest of this period. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Anita, for this wonderful session. I thank each one of you for your participation in this webinar and really hope that it enriches your knowledge. We hope you will join one of our other upcoming webinars too. You will receive a very short feedback survey soon on your email, and please fill that, as it will help us to improve our future webinars and make your experience even better. On that note, a big thank you to all of you. Stay safe.